Anyway, I don't want to get sidetracked here, but drop a comment down below if you would like a video of me bitching about standard fantasy races and how to make them more distinct and interesting. Gotta be honest, I wasn't expecting so many people to respond, but I said what I said. If you enjoy this video, please don't forget to like and subscribe. Standard fantasy races, you know them, I know them, they're the handy cookie-cutter molds to use when you're trying to make a whole different world from scratch. The idea should be that you build on those generic outlines to make something new and interesting, but in many a forgettable fantasy, they are simply plopped down with barely any effort to really do anything with them. So, what do we have? Humans, elves, dwarves, orcs, and goblins. Let's see what we can do to improve matters. The factory standard for humans in fantasy settings is them being the most widespread yet mundane of the species inhabiting the world. It makes sense for humans to be the most prevalent, if only because of author and narrative bias. It's a story written by a human that is going to be told to humans. However, I don't think that's giving your writing or your audience enough credit if you really think that they won't connect with a character or a world because it isn't dominated by humanity. Children of Time by Adrian Tchaikovsky is an incredible science fiction book about empathy. What does it make you empathize with? Spiders. Intelligent, emotional, thinking, feeling spiders as they evolve through the stages of becoming fully sapient beings. It is one of the best xenofiction stories I've ever read, and if that sounds like something you'd be into, please check it out. It's great. Back on track. Standard fantasy humans will often default to this unspecified mishmash of vaguely European-flavored, medieval-ish trappings. If they're feeling spicy, they will have multiple factions based on different real-world civilizations, which is all fine and dandy, unless the other species only have one, because you've already decided their culture and humanity is just so special and interesting that they have multiple different societies and cultures. See, this is the other thing with humans in fantasy, and science fiction to be honest, that bugs me, when they're presented as the most versatile and adaptable over and above any other species. It's not that humans can't be special, it's just the way it's often done in less creative settings feels lazy to me. I find that humans are also often the youngest of the known species. Elves and usually dwarves are long established and more advanced, especially elves. They have less magical and mechanical know-how, but for some reason haven't been conquered because inherent human perseverance or something. I'm also not particularly a fan of humans dominating, just being better than the other species at everything. Ultimately, I want it to feel balanced, because if it's weighed too far in one direction, I start having questions that the author was never going to answer, like, if humans are so young and weak, why aren't they vassals of a neighboring civilization right now? If humans are so good at everything, why aren't they the only ones here? Which, I concede, is a bleak way of looking at it. So, the first idea that comes to mind for me is making your humans fantasy Russians, which can take care of multiple issues at the same time. Comparatively young species able to hold their own and defend large territories against more advanced civilizations. They live in the fantasy equivalent of Russia, where trying to attack during cold weather periods is a nightmare even the most well-equipped armies would shudder at. I also feel like when a human civilization lives somewhere cold, they're usually vaguely Scottish, quote-unquote, Vikings, even though that was a job title, not a people, or in the worst case, some horrific mix of both that attacks me personally. Point is, I don't think I've seen a lot of fantasy humans take after Russia. The Witcher doesn't count, that's Polish. Eastern Europeans is not the same, and I think it would start a small war in the comments if you said otherwise. A fantasy equivalent of Iran, geographically speaking, would serve the same purpose of making it logistically difficult to invade your humans when they're surrounded by more advanced civilizations, as well as give you a more specific culture to base things off of other than vaguely Middle Eastern. And when I say more advanced civilizations, I don't mean to say that the civilization for your humans is primitive or lesser than, simply if they have a technological advantage, there has to be a reason that it hasn't been used against them. It'd be remiss of me to not address the elephant in the room that when standard fantasy humans are brought up, the first thing that comes to mind is almost always going to be vaguely European white people, which is not to say that you can't make your fantasy humans white or that you can't make European cultures interesting. It's just something to keep in mind when putting your world together. What makes your setting stand out? How are your fantasy humans different? If they're a young, weak species in the setting, lean into that. Everyone else is an advanced civilization and humans are practically still cavemen, half-wild tribes who live in mountains and forests who use their smarts, coordination, and vocal mimicry to horrifying effect when hunting anyone who trespasses on their territory. Am I making humans sound like weird birds? Good. Make your humans cryptids if they're going to be less advanced, and before someone says it, you should also keep in mind what kind of vibe it would give off if you choose to make your less advanced, scary tribal humans universally not white. I'm really not trying to be the friend who is too woke. I'm just like, just put a pin in that at the back of your mind. Unintentional messages, connotations, etc. It doesn't have to be a big serious thing, just like keep it in your back pocket. Other things to make your humans more distinct as a fantasy species. How did they come to be? Did a creator god make them? Did they evolve naturally, magically? Were they a slave race created by one of the other civilizations that then broke free? Did the first humans emerge from a primordial body of water with blank stares and empty minds running only on instinct until their souls ignited? Do not be afraid to get weird with it just because it's humans. We are a weird, terrifying species, even by Earth standards. We can survive injuries that would kill other animals. We are smart enough to overcome our physical limitations with tools, and smart enough to vocalize differently depending on our prey. We're persistent to the extreme, we sweat to cool down during pursuit, we run our prey to exhaustion, we developed surgery before general anesthesia. What I'm getting at is that I'm a big fan of humans as space orcs concept, where our myriad traits are considered freaky as hell to aliens. So why not bring that to a fantasy setting? Make the origins as magical as the setting. Give humans psychic powers that mean most other species don't trust them because they're suspicious of humans reading their minds. Or instead of being able to read minds, it makes humans empaths by nature, and that can lead down all sorts of paths from being more prone to cooperation and diplomacy, to some humans using rituals and meditation to shut down their empath abilities, to others being driven mad by it, and others using it to manipulate their way through the world. Maybe humans have a natural affinity for a type of elemental magic, so their society is shaped by that, in the vein of The Last Airbender, or something completely different to that. My point is that you're placing humans into a fantasy setting, and it feels odd to not take advantage of the opportunities that opens up. Even if you never explicitly explain your lore, having an origin in mind can inform how you write this species. On one hand, I really like elves. On the other hand, it's very easy to make them boring. I expressed my dissatisfaction with elves that are barely distinguishable from humans in the past, and I stand by my appreciation for World of Warcraft elves due to them being immediately physically distinct from humans due to their whisker eyebrows, long ears, and glowing eyes. This especially goes for night elves, who are purple-skinned and 7-foot-tall wild forest people, the warrior women of which an orc character referred to as savage and perfect warriors. In Divinity Original Sin 2, elves have elongated bodies with leaf vein patterns on their skin, and they can gain people's memories by eating their flesh, or licking them. It really depends on how skilled the elf is, but primarily the method is full-on cannibalism. In the Elder Scrolls, the Wood Elves who live by the Green Pact are consummate carnivores. They use everything from an animal's body and never waste any meat. And I do mean any meat. It's more cannibalism. Do you see the through line here of inverting the generic version of elves as these pretty, pristine, Art Nouveau, above-it-all bearers of ancient wisdom? That shit rocks. But that doesn't mean that you can't make non-cannibal elves interesting, of course. It's just the most extreme example I can point to of how to make your long-lived pointy-eared nerds interesting. One way we could do this is by giving elves a thanatotic or necromantic culture. They're so ancient and long-lived in part because their religion is heavily focused on the cycle of life, death, and what comes after. Perhaps they've lasted so long as a civilization because they're defended by an army made up of warriors who agree to be bound to their armor on death and now serve as unyielding soldiers who aren't afraid of injury or death. And it wouldn't have to be all, dreadful weather, ghouls, ghosts, and goblins, etc., though those could certainly be prevalent. Notice that I said the religion also focuses on life. So imagine pristine skeletons tirelessly working crop fields on a sunny afternoon, walking down the road into a nearby forest that starts familiar enough, but eventually you begin to notice the trees changing the deeper you go. The bark becomes paler. The color of the leaves slowly deepens and shifts to red, until you are walking through a forest of bone-white trees and a carmine canopy, the roots dimly pulsing red with a low, barely noticeable heartbeat, as you finally begin to see cenotaphs marking where local families bury their dead in the grave forest. Do you see what I'm getting at? Mixing that traditional idea of elf means nature with something that adds some extra flavor to it. Original ideas are great and all, but hard to come up with, and chances are high someone somewhere has already done it. So stop stressing about making something completely unique and think about what you would change about things you already know to make them interesting again to you. If someone is tired of seeing elves in fantasy, but you put something together that makes them enjoy elves again, that is an achievement. As for physical designs, lean into the fact that they are not human. Give them long expressive ears, cat-like eyes, sharp teeth, hell, give them tails. Play with the weirdness that a fantasy setting offers. Of course, it all depends on what your fantasy setting is like, what kind of fantasy it is. For the necro-elves, I'd make them look more ghoulish or ghost-like, ethereal in a way that's unsettling, like hollow cheeks and almost translucent skin. Maybe they're willowy and they float more than they walk. Maybe they all have black eyes with just a pinprick of light to them. And instead of defaulting to scary and creepy means evil, they could just be like that. They could still mean well and be kind, especially to people who are scared of death, afraid of losing loved ones, grieving people they've lost. So maybe these spooky elves can make for really good counselors, graveyard keepers, morticians and the like, because by virtue of their culture, they're just very compassionate about the whole thing. Or you could have spooky metal death elves who forcibly add people to their army and use their enemies' bones for weapons. I'm not your mother, do what you want, I'm just throwing out ideas I think are neat. Oh, dwarves. My perpetual conflict with them always comes down to whether or not a given medium hired actual Scottish people to voice them or not. But no, there are a lot of ways to go about dwarves, one of which I will link in the description because these designs for insectoid beetle dwarves are absolutely incredible and I love them. Go check it out. You know the generic fantasy dwarf. Short, strong, bearded, loves beer, fighting, smithing, and speaks in an egregiously painful accent. They're also usually depicted as having animosity towards elves. That last one is something the Elder Scrolls series turned on its head by making the dwarves of its setting a subspecies of elf or mer known as the Dwemer. The same can be said about orcs, cursed elves, or mer known as Orsimer. Not that any of the other elves would ever acknowledge them as such, but it's still neat, it's an interesting detail. It's such a simple change that makes them a little more distinct. It doesn't have to be a dramatic change if you don't want to remake them from scratch. If you're going to make dwarves fantasy Scottish, then embrace it. Give them clans, kilts, tartan, have them gather once a year for their version of the Highland Games, have them tend to herds of Highland cows, play bagpipes from the tops of their mountain homes, because that is how bagpipes are meant to be heard. They're not meant for a confined space. Don't give them haggis as a food and then make a whole thing about how gross and off-putting it is just because all you know about haggis is that it's made with organs, specifically sheep's heart, liver, and lungs, and you personally don't like the idea of that. Show appreciation for the culture you are implementing. Don't just regurgitate tired, insulting stereotypes like the angry drunk Scot. On a different note, have you ever thought about aquatic dwarves? Dwarves are often associated with earth or fire for obvious reasons. They live in mountains, they mine metals, they forge things. But imagine dwarves who have a natural affinity for water, the element that carves through mountains and shapes continents. Maybe the dwarves were completely subterranean to start with, never had contact with the surface, but one day an underwater earthquake shattered the ceiling of their home and the ocean flooded in. In desperation, they cry out to their gods and are changed forever, emerging from a fissure at the bottom of the sea as creatures of the water and earth combined. They have compact, powerful bodies with finned tails to push them through the water, gills that draw water in through the neck and out through more gill slits below the ribs. They use their power over water to carve out new homes and learn to shape coral and seaweed, mastering the materials they find throughout the sea until they begin to make settlements along the coastlines. These would largely be like hidden cave systems with underwater entrances, but people on the land would begin to notice pillars of smoke from cooking and forge fires. These dwarves would be able to breathe air and survive out of the water, but they'd be much more at home in the ocean. They would make excellent navigators for ships, a terrifying deterrent against pirates, because imagine a bunch of stout shark-like humanoids suddenly scaling your ship from the water, and generally act as monitors for the health of the water and local ecosystems. They would still live in caves and mountains, they're just underwater now. They still work with metals, it's just any forges they make have to be on islands or coastlines, resulting in production hubs that specialize in different things based on what's available. Maybe as a result of this change to their bodies, or because they have always been this way, they give birth like sharks, either by laying eggs in protected clusters, or giving live birth, where instead of being excited to feel kicks, the mother is excited when she can feel her children moving inside her, because that means they're eating each other and the strongest will be born soon. They see this as a natural part of the process and a good sign, something to celebrate. Still keeping with the mountains, you could make your dwarves Peruvian, or more specifically Incan, and have them live in mountains like these that look like they're draped in green blankets. Have them build temples to the sun at the peaks and be known for their incredible craftsmanship with gold and beautiful textiles that carry solar motifs. Simpler than the aquatic change, but already more distinct than generic dwarves. Yes, the conveniently hostile race of people who are all biologically wired to be evil, that's definitely not something worth examining. You may be one of the people who rolled their eyes whenever racism allegations were brought up around the depiction of orcs in various pieces of media, but, this is how we started with orcs. So on one hand, people can absolutely make something out of nothing, and there's something to be said for a certain brand of white people posturing to look like they're the most aware and virtuous in the room, but being concerned about racial coding does not come out of nowhere. And we will bring that up again with goblins, because oh boy. To be fair, orcs since Tolkien have gone through some positive changes from being wholly evil to that proud warrior race archetype that is most exemplified by World of Warcraft, but trading one cardboard cutout for another is still not great, so let's see what we can do. The first thing that comes to mind is inverting the traditional idea of orcs and fashion them after Victorian-era England, that mix of industrial grime juxtaposed with tailcoats, top hats, and frilly dresses. The upper classes present a front of refinement and pomp, but everyone knows not to mess with the orcs, because behind that well-mannered mask is the same roaring demon their soldiers become on the battlefield. Have them prefer diplomacy, not because they don't like to fight, but because as a culture they're afraid of liking it too much and falling apart as a society. Maybe it happened once before and it was so bloody and devastating that they decided to never let it happen again because next time they might not survive as a people. Maybe they prize wellness and psychological health because of this, so orcs are the ones who develop psychological analysis and the practice of structured therapy in the setting. They find ways to work through their issues that don't involve violence but nonetheless engage in combat sports like boxing in highly regulated settings so that there is still an outlet. Self-control and discipline is highly valued, so it's seen as a great shame to lose your temper, and orcs who can't control their emotions are often stigmatized. In the best case, they're pushed towards getting help, and in the worst case, they're pushed to the edge of society and ostracized for being feral. Even if you were to keep the warrior culture of the orcs, instead of defaulting to the, somewhat tricky Mongolian inspiration, imagine them as a mix of Norse and Japanese. The idea of a glorious afterlife for warriors who died in battle, but here it's warriors who maintained their honor, who fought with integrity and discipline, who served the country loyally, were at all times in control of themselves and did not shed undeserving blood. That is not to say I'm pulling from historical fact regarding Vikings and samurai. I know it was more complicated and often far less glamorous than the pop culture version, but we're having fun with fantasy bullshit, so as long as you're not being horribly offensive, go nuts. If you want to keep the more shamanistic flavor of orcs, perhaps in this setting, orcs are the oldest of the known species instead of elves, shaped from the earth by their creator god who breathed life and fire into them. They prefer to live in dry, hot, mountainous regions, building grand cities of sandstone, marble, and glass that glitter in the sun. Like the earth, they are patient and slow to change, unless they are provoked, and, like the earth, when tectonic plates shift and the pressure builds too much, they erupt, releasing devastation. But outside of that, they are scholarly and spiritualistic, discussing philosophy in the early hours of the evening over glasses of tea and shisha pipes. Perhaps they are fond of outsiders and the younger races visiting them because it keeps them in touch with the rest of the world. New perspectives and ideas are challenged, dissected, and catalogued for the future, and young orcs are often encouraged to go on a pilgrimage where they bring back something new, a piece of knowledge and invention, even something as seemingly trivial as a cookbook, because even the way a region treats its food can reveal something about its people. As for physical designs, you could always stick with the traditional appearance of green skin, tusks, and pointed ears. You could also play with it. Maybe the ancient earthborn orcs have volcanic veins that glow faintly with the fire of their creator god, and their eyes light up when they're experiencing heightened emotions. Their tusks could be some form of organic metal that they take care to polish and decorate with inlays. The Victorian orcs could be lean and fastidious about their appearance because they want to present the image of a respectable refinement and decorum, none of which has to abide by gender norms as the average reader would think of it, which goes for all of these entries. Do not hear me say that you have to make your entire setting a non-binary bonanza. I'm simply pointing out that you have many options, and I'm not judging you for going for what is familiar. Just don't be afraid to experiment. Well, there's certainly a lot that could be done wrong, and definitely has been done wrong with the depiction of goblins, not least of which borrowing heavily from a very specific type of propaganda, which is really not great. So let's see what we can do here. Traditional folklore goblins are mischievous little freaks covered in fur, just looking for an opportunity to mess with someone for the giggles or do them malicious harm, often thought of as mischievous spirits in the same vein as fairies or demons. So let's take that and combine it with some of the more positive traits of modern goblin depictions, like their ingenuity and resourcefulness. We keep the mischievous nature, add a dash of fairy ancestry, and make the goblins more simian in appearance, since wee monkeys and large apes alike are often deeply unserious creatures who like doing silly things for the fun of it. This opens up a large swath of design options, especially if we include common offshoots like hobgoblins or bugbears, both of which are also traditionally household spirits of folkloric creatures similar to the boogeyman. Perhaps these goblins were originally denizens of a Fey realm before they decided it would be really funny to escape and ended up trapped in the mortal plane. Whoopsie daisy. But being good-natured and taking most things in stride, they adapted and grew to like it in the mortal plane. They love exploring and experiencing new things, and most goblins just want to have a good time, especially if it makes someone feel better, because as a group, they value not leaving anyone to feel left out and alone. They would be a highly communal and cooperative culture with a great passion for the arts and particularly for theatre. Due to being from a Fey realm, these goblins could have an affinity for magic that gives them control over nature, able to manipulate plants to create their homes, and for some, this Fey ancestry could make them predisposed to illusion magic. Of course, the positive traits can be inverted because no people are a monolith, and some goblins would just be little bastards who like playing malicious fatal tricks on unsuspecting victims. They can make expert assassins due to their small stature to strength ratio, their ability to climb most surfaces, and the use of that illusion magic. Another route you could take if you want to make your goblins a bit gritty and ruthless while still differentiating them from the generic tropes is model them after 19th century Italy. World of Warcraft has some Mafia, Godfather-esque trappings to its goblins, but they never really commit to it, which I've always found really frustrating, because goblins are one of the playable races in the game that tend to be painted with a slapstick brush, the other usually being gnomes. Anyway, these goblins could look more like bats, and then you dress them up like 19th century Italians with all the vineyards, olive oil, and delicious seafood you can imagine. Playing into that, if you go with goblins being the oldest species of your setting, maybe they're living with the ruins of their ancient glorious past as a world-dominating power scattered across their homeland. They aren't that superpower anymore, but that history is something they take pride in and believe they could be again, given the right circumstances. Most goblins are relaxed and genial, and they love to welcome people with good food and wine, but maybe there are goblins who detest outsiders, who see the world as leeches, coasting off the achievements of the old goblin empire. They want to return to a time when it ruled. And I'll be honest, this is where I ran out of steam, and I wanted to keep pushing and come up with more ideas, but this feels like a good moment to acknowledge that writing is hard. Being creative and coming up with new takes on established tropes can be exhausting, and sometimes it's just easier to go with what's familiar so you can focus on some other part of the project that needs your attention. I understand how these things happen, and I sympathize with it because my depressed ass barely made it to the end of this. Still, as I said for the dwarf entry, the change doesn't have to be something super involved. It can just be depicting a standard fantasy race through a culture they usually aren't, and as long as it's done with sincerity and respect, then you should be fine. Fantasy is for everyone. It can be messy and unintentional and carries a lot of problematic holdovers from previous generations. But that's for us to do something about, because we know better. And if you don't, then you can always learn. Even if it's just one bit at a time, and it feels like someone is rubbing sandpaper against your brain, every effort counts. So keep making it. Thank you for watching, and if you enjoyed this video, don't forget to like, subscribe, and drop a comment down below for the algorithm gods. Special shout out to my YouTube members and patrons who are all very handsome people. If you'd also like to be called a very handsome people, you can support what I do here or check out the link in the description. Members and tip jar patrons get their name in the credits, while patrons of the nerd tier will occasionally get behind the scenes content and video teasers. If you enjoy live streaming, I can be found over on Twitch, where I typically stream every Wednesday at 8 PM British time. But for now, don't forget to drink your water, take your medication, be kind to yourselves, and I will see you all next time.